By 2035, the state pension becomes fiscally insolvent, fiscally unsustainable. You can't smell it, you can't taste it, it's building up. By 2035, it detonates. And, you have this serious issue where you just can't pay it anymore. Not without massive fiscal restructuring of the British economy, wherein all we're doing now is just paying for two things: health and state pension. So the UK essentially becomes a nursing home with a tax farm attached to it, right? That's really where we're looking here. You can get rid of infrastructure, housing stops, we stop spending on defense. That all becomes secondary to this issue, right? Because this is, by 2035, that's where it is. And the thing just detonates. And then, I think at that point we default. We're paying over 100 billion pounds a year on debt interest. Like, it's huge amounts of money. That will look inconsequential compared to, the size of the issue that we're just running headlong towards. So it requires very, very serious and very, very rapid change, probably in the next government.
If you think the government's £2.8 trillion debt is bad, you ain't seen nothing yet. According to my guest today, in 2021, which is the last time it was measured, the British pension system amounted to total obligations to the British public of £8.9 trillion and rising fast. Even worse, the capacity of the people to pay is diminishing thanks to demographic trends. And for once, someone has calculated when all of this will go belly up. Maxwell Marlow is the Director of Research at the Adam Smith Institute. I also want to quickly mention that he was twice consecutive president of the Hayek Society and a fellow at the Mercator Center of George Mason University. Why is that worth mentioning? Well, Maxwell is some sort of academic version of me. If I hadn't been hired in 2010 to become a newsletter writer, I would have pursued pretty much exactly the career path that Maxwell has, down to the specific places in the US even. And it's not often you get to meet a version of yourself that's been existing on a different plane. So Maxwell, sorry to make this awkward for you, mate, but it's great to meet you.
You too, my friend. It's an absolute pleasure. And thank you for having me.
So you've written this report for the Adam Smith Institute, which you're the Director of Research of. It's called Up in Flames, the State Pension by 2035. It's a pretty dramatic name for a think tank, don't you think?
I would say so. I mean, if you think for a think tank, Adam Smith Institute, I think that's perfectly fine. But as far as reports go, it is dramatic. But, this is what happens when you let the state spending go out of control. The entire Treasury may just burst into flames. So let's hope policies change and things get better.
I don't think that's likely, man. I think that's a whistling in the wind. But at least someone will listen to you here, because I think the point of this channel is that investors will figure out what to do about these predictions. Let's start with the cracking opening quote of your report. It's the first paragraph. I'm just going to read this word for word because I think it's brilliant. The state pension is one of the thorniest issues in British politics today, straddling questions about intergenerational inequality, our tax regime, and the role of the nature of the welfare state. It is also becoming an increasingly existential one. Again, that's a huge claim. Before we get to the evidence, though, what do you mean by an existential issue?
Well, what I really think is the problem here is that if this isn't fixed, this can go one of two ways. So the first way is that we have essentially disenfranchisement from the social contract. And I know that's quite an American term, but I think it's important to use here. Young people are paying eye-watering amounts of tax in jobs which are increasingly less productive, and they're seeing fewer and fewer returns in their day-to-day lives. So they're looking forward to, paying and getting something out. And by 2035, according to the research we've done here, that is unlikely to happen. They'll probably be paying even more tax for even fewer children that they'll be having because they can't afford to have any. And essentially, we're going to end up with a really broken social contract. I'd say it's broken already, but it's going to get even worse. I mean, the other big thing is, of course, the amount of tax being paid to prop up this completely corrupt Ponzi scheme of the system will just totally tank the economy. We're already at about 38% of total tax take over the economy. So that's, of £1, 100 pence of all the money, in the economy, really, 38 pence is going out on taxes. So that's going to be pushed even higher if we don't fix the system by 2035. So that's pretty totemic, I'd say.
You're completely stealing the thunder or backing up a different video. I'm not sure when it'll be released, which analyzes this issue of if you cut this much government waste, what happens to GDP and the economy. But let's focus on this idea of a social contract. Usually the people you and I listen to and read will say something along the lines of, there's no such thing as a social contract. We never agreed to this. We didn't sign on. It wasn't clear. But in the case of the state pension, you can argue that that was kind of like a social contract, right? We've had these promises and these payments that we've made contributions to over the years. So it really does feel like there is one. So I think your analysis is disproportionately important here. And there is this issue of people are going to be pretty upset.
And they should be. I mean, when we speak to politicians and even voters about this, they do come back with the answer is, but I've paid in my whole life. Now, we know that's not entirely true. Now, there are aspects of that being true. We'll come on to it later in the video. But people do feel like they've got a stake here, and they think there is sort of a bank account with their name on it, full of the money they've been paying in. We know that's not the case. But even if people, even if the facts are clear that it's not the case, people still think it to be. And, the interesting thing with politics is, things that are untrue are very much true in electoral terms. So that's kind of the big issue here, which is that, this social contract is on the basis of expectation. And the big issue that, politics have been kicking down the road, this, this very expensive can, is essentially that, I will eventually, when I retire, when I'm 80 something, I'll be able to draw off a bit of my state pension that I've been paying in for the last 60 odd years. So that's just not going to happen. And, in the case of this system, it's just a complete improbability.
It's so sad that people sort of, put the coat of their retirement on the hook of a political promise. Like we know in our day-to-day lives what political promises are worth. But for some reason, we believe this one. Let's move on to some of the important things people need to understand in order to understand this discussion and this report. Probably the most important one is the idea of the triple lock. So take us through what it means and the importance of it in whether the state pension is going to survive.
Sure thing. So the triple lock is one of the most disastrous pieces of policy ever produced by a British government. The idea was essentially made up on the spot by David Cameron during, I believe it was the 2015 election. And it's the idea essentially that the state pension will rise by one of three ways. And I note there it will rise. So it is guaranteed to go up no matter what happens. So it either goes up by CPI inflation. So that's consumer price inflation. It either goes up by the average wage increase, so basically to keep up incomes with wages, even if you're retired and not working, or finally 2.5%. And for the last few years, it's been CPI-led or wage-led. It hasn't been 2.5 for some time. But nonetheless, it is essentially locked into the system that the cost of this goes up and up and up, regardless of what happens to inputs. So that's kind of the big issue here. And that's what we've been campaigning for years to remove, is the idea of the triple lock. It just needs to go. It's completely unsustainable.
Let's explore why, though, because, I mean, there's this story of the most powerful force in the universe is compounding, and we're dealing with small percentage increases, but over long periods of time. The percentage increases have not been so small recently, thanks to inflation. But what could possibly be wrong with the triple lock, as you've explained it? You've set the bar pretty high by saying that it's the worst policy ever from the British government, but it doesn't sound like it's that bad.
Of course, it doesn't sound so bad, but the issue is, these things don't sound that menacing at all. But when you look at the size, the total scale of the state pension scheme, I mean, it is absolutely ginormous. We're talking 42% of total welfare spending. It's huge. And given that already we spend so much on welfare, this is the largest item, in that budget area, and that's going up at least 2.5% a year. That's crazy. And for us, the main issue here is that it's uncontrolled. You can't control what the inputs are going to be in the future. If there is a large recession, for example, if there's a really big 1920s scale financial crash, the British government is still obligated by law to withdraw taxes from the productive economy or borrow the money, which is increasingly the case, and to pay out increasingly. It doesn't make any sense. We wouldn't do this with our household budgets at all. Could you imagine if you just went to your energy company and said, yes, I'm happy paying 2.5% at least in perpetuity forever and ever, or by one of these other metrics that we just can't really control. The energy company would be delighted with the system, as are these voters. But you, the bill payer, and that's us taxpayers, are livid and would be livid if they understood this, as you rightly point out, the most powerful force in the universe, compound interest. So it is so damaging, and it's very, very worrying.
Yeah, I've got to say, 2.5% doesn't sound so bad, compared to what my wife and kids demand as the increases in spending each year. But the issue here is that you've got a promise to pay an unsustainable amount given the demographics and the economics. Almost by definition, over time, it's going to grow. It's going to outgrow the capacity to pay. One of the things that makes it interesting to me is I hinted earlier that you've applied a forecast here for when this starts to go drastically wrong. But the triple lock makes it extraordinarily difficult to make such a forecast because you don't know what the force is going to be, right? Wage growth, inflation, or 2.5%. So how have you dealt with that? How have you made this forecast despite the fact that it's so difficult?
So essentially what we did is we built a plug and play model. So quite simple, but dynamic. So we've got a few different variables in there. So for example, we've taken average wage growth over this period, basically looking back from 1990 onwards, about what the average wage growth there was. We've obviously factored in the 2.5%. We factored in long-term trends of migration into the British economy. So it's difficult with the Boris wave of immigration, which was a huge amount, over 1 million people net, a year by 2021. It was huge, but that's kind of off trend. So we've averaged that out. So we forecast that coming down. So have the Home Office, so they don't see that being as high. So essentially, we just locked that in over time period. We included inflation, so we take a real cost here. And we basically come to the conclusion with these variables, and we can change them if need be, as I said, plug and play, that by 2035, the state pension becomes fiscally insolvent, fiscally unsustainable. And what that means is by 2025, there are more outputs going out than inputs. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that because the state pension fund, the national insurance fund that is in the Treasury, does have reserves of about 70 billion. So it doesn't become bankrupt, but it does become fiscally insolvent. So that's kind of what we're dealing with here, and that's why we didn't go out and say it becomes bankrupt, because that would be false. But what we do say is, you're paying out more than you're getting in at that point in time, ceteris paribus. So that's really what the concern is here, and that's by 2035. Now, what we didn't include is, if Nigel Farage came into power tomorrow and he gets, immigration down to net zero, so we don't bring in any more economic immigrants, we let the population age to a certain extent, it goes fiscally insolvent by 2030. The problem is the model starts at 2030. So actually what happens here is we see essentially an immediate insolvency of the state pension system if we stop migration immediately. So that's really very concerning. So now we are relying on importing immigrants to the UK to prop up a system which doesn't work. And from research from a think tank down the road from us, the Centre for Policy Studies, we know that actually a lot of the immigrants coming into the UK are actually net liabilities on the taxpayer. They cost way more over their life period of about 60 years to the taxpayer than they bring in. So essentially, we're importing even more costs. So the problem here is a policy problem. It's not an economic problem. It is a policy problem. It is designed to go bust at some point, and politicians don't have the guts or the nerve to step in and fix that problem.
The other video I hinted at earlier about this idea of when you make cuts, you cause a recession. One of the points that Ed Dowd, who I interviewed, made was that you can sort of fudge the figures with immigration. He talks about illegal immigration in the US. In our case, in the UK, it's overwhelmingly legal. They are a net burden over the course of our life. But while we bring them in, they're a national insurance contribution, right? Which makes the pension part of this look a little bit better in the short run, at least. There's not irony there. I want to say that I'm deeply disappointed in you for using government forecasts as the basis of your model here, given how those panned out in the past.
Yeah, so this is the thing. So the Adam Smith Institute, we always rely on government numbers, and we say that very clearly because, if we have critics who come in and want to criticize our numbers, we just go straight to government. We say, look, this is a government problem. We are a very small think tank. There are 7 of us. I'm 25. I run the research. So we're a very small little insurgent group. I don't have the resourcing all the time to go out and start doing this privately. It would probably cost the same as the state pension on scales, right? For me to go out and do this research independently, right? So we're using these kind of open source government statistics, and that's as best it's going to come. I mean, this morning as we're recording this, the ONS came out with their, and the OBR came out with their forecasts, for financial figures. We saw that the forecast and the outturn, there's about a £14 billion difference in those numbers, which again doesn't sound like much if we're just talking about those small numbers, but £14 billion is ginormous. It's obliterated the Chancellor's headroom. So this is one of the big issues we're facing, and actually it's government modelling, which is just so disastrous.
It hasn't just obliterated the Chancellor's fiscal headroom, whatever they called it. It's also obliterated a debate that everyone's been going bonkers over for months now, right? I think I'm not accusing you of not having the correct figures here. I understand that the right thing to do is use the government's figures and then say, and probably it's going to be worse. But it just makes the whole thing look ridiculous, these latest figures. And the fact that even on the government's own figures, it's going to be as bad as you've done the maths on in this report. But let's turn to what I think everyone who's watching this video is thinking, who hasn't heard about these issues before, and that's that you must be wrong, because we've been paying national insurance contributions into this pot that is going to be at the end of the rainbow when we retire, and therefore we can't possibly run out of funds because we've been paying in so much over the years.
Yeah, so that's, as I said, that's sort of the myth that goes around, which is that we have this account with our name on it and money comes in through that account. No, not really at all. Now, there are kind of savings that the government hold on to, and they do invest them, which is surprisingly, sensible for a government to do. So we can see that it will last a few years past this forecast. However, now governments can't go bankrupt, and the fund can actually pull finances out of other government areas. As we know, there's no money left. So where on earth these finances are going to come from? So government can either print the money, it can grow the economy to extract more taxation. That's not happening. Or they can raise taxes, which, as I said earlier, we are overtaxed. And as the forecast this morning show, we are way past the tip of the laughter curve. We were dancing around at the top for a few years, and now we're sliding down the other side. So this is essentially what we're saying here is, yes, there is an issue with the state pension, but is indicative of a larger problem. So I'd say, take this research as a big criticism of the state pension system, look at the cost of it, but it's only one aspect. It's only one aspect of all these other welfare programs we have, of our, nationalized socialist healthcare system, which is absolutely dreadful. That needs more money as well, of course. And without reform, these things aren't going to change. So to come back to the original question, there is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. There's a pot of dung, right? And it's that is what we are sliding into here. It's going to be really messy the more we leave it, and it's going to be incredibly expensive for young taxpayers like myself and my colleagues. Other people my age down the system who aren't going to see the benefits of this. We just experience the costs. That's the big issue. And your listeners too, who are obviously paying large amounts of tax, huge amounts of tax, to fund a really broken system, and it's just being wasted, or to quote Boris Johnson, spaffed up the wall.
So you explain in the report how this myth sort of plays out and why it's wrong, which you do very well. But what I want to point out here is the amusingness of the sort of have your cake and eat it story, which is, on the one hand, politicians tell us you've been paying national insurance to create this fund, so that there's this pot of gold at the end of the story. But they also tell us that national insurance contributions are funding things like the NHS. And people just seem to believe that you can have both at the same time. And they don't seem to wake up to the fact that, well, if our national insurance contribution increases recently going to the NHS, then what about the state pension?
Yeah, well, it's cakeism, right? And you're right. I mean, yeah, people look at national insurance and go, oh, yes, well, that's just the fund. I know I've got my national insurance number, and that's just my account. It just all gets diverted in there. Fine. No, it's just a medium through which the government can extort more tax. I was at a really interesting meeting a few months ago with a load of, proper tax experts, tax lawyers, barristers, people from the Institute for Fiscal Studies, Institute of Taxation, all these different, people who spend their whole life looking at the tax system. And we all agreed, from us libertarians at the Adam Smith Institute all the way through to people who are quite far on the left, all said national insurance is just double income tax. It's just exactly the same, and it's charged your employer doesn't pay your income tax. They may process it for you through PAYE, but they're not paying it for you. This also charges employers. So that's through employers' national insurance contributions, which has been a huge debate, over the last few months, as you pointed out earlier. I pay it as a payee. My employer pays it as an employer. So essentially, it's just a double tax. And what we want to see it merged together and then cut, because it is so grossly inefficient. We know that national insurance is a jobs tax, and if I take standard Pigovian theory and I say I tax that which I do not want to occur, we wonder why there are job losses and a lack of new employment nowadays. So the whole thing is just broken, and I spend my time here screaming into my hands, going, "Why don't you see this? Just fix it. You're the government. You can do this." But we can see with things like, your British listeners will be aware of the big debate at the moment over winter fuel allowance, which is an additional benefit that the government was given to all pensioners. So as long as you were retired, you were guaranteed to have over £100 paid off your energy bill by fiat from the government. They cut that down to be means tested, so only if you're on something called pension credit, you could pay for that off. The backlash was ginormous. And I had a really interesting conversation with a few Labour MPs about this. And I said, guys, you do realise you've just burned all of your political capital on, this very small, £100 a year benefit for pensioners, when you could have used that political capital to go after the state pension, to go after the triple lock and solve so many more problems. And they went, yeah, we know, and they were very upset about it. So this is the issue. It's all politics, and it is so frustrating because you can throw as many numbers as this that you want. You can throw as many numbers as you want at this. It's not going to change the game on the ground.
Yeah, and the debate is constructed in such a way that you're going to end up spending it talking about things that don't really make sense, such as, it's the national insurance. No, it's the income tax. Well, if you're not separating the funds anyway, then it doesn't make a difference. Let me try and summarize the dramatic conclusion of your report. And we're going to show this chart that you have of the point of fiscal unsustainability as I do this, so that people can understand the real claim that I think, the specific claim that your report is making. So in the mid-2030s, the state pension will outgrow national insurance contributions and start to eat up the rest of the government's budget, making it politically dangerous. What do you make of that? Have I got it right?
I'd say you're almost there. It's already politically dangerous. It's the big issue. I'd say is fiscally dangerous. It's actually a fiscal poison pill. I don't know if you've watched Chernobyl. That great HBO series that came out, and they go through, this kind of sequence in the core explaining why the RBMK reactor at the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin power plant exploded. And they talk about the buildup of argon gas, right? And, this is an inert gas which, doesn't react, and it essentially caused the reactor to blow up. Now, I'm not a nuclear physicist, so I may have got that a bit wrong. But this sort of overlap, this massive cost is building up silently, and it's building up quiet, very quiet, and it's very transparent. You can't smell it, you can't taste it. It's building up. By 2035, it detonates, and you have this serious issue where you just can't pay it anymore, not without massive fiscal restructuring of the British economy, wherein all we're doing now is just paying for two things: health and state pension. So the UK essentially becomes a nursing home with a tax farm attached to it, right? That's really where we're looking here. You can get rid of infrastructure, housing stops, we stop spending on defense. That all becomes secondary to this issue, right? Because this is, by 2035, that's where it is. And the thing just detonates. And then, I think at that point we default. We're paying over 100 billion pounds a year on debt interest. Like, it's huge amounts of money. That will look inconsequential compared to, the size of the issue that we're just running headlong towards. So it requires very, very serious and very, very rapid change, probably in the next government.
Yeah, that illusion of the national insurance funds to state pension is what's going to pop. And all of a sudden, there's going to be this issue of trade-offs where politicians really do have to choose between funding the state pension and, as you say, defence and all these other issues. The calculations are based on 2021 figures. That's pretty recent when it comes to your typical pension system maths. Some things have happened since then, to put it mildly. So take us through what you think the effect of inflation in 2022 and 23, national insurance hikes, and I suppose we've talked about immigration. You've suggested immigration cuts would make all of this worse. But take us through inflation and national insurance hikes.
Sure thing. So the national insurance hikes were brought in because I think the government realised that, I think they read the research and they went, oh God, okay. So I think they do understand we need to start paying a little bit more attention to this. The problem is, of course, now inflation is going up. It will continue to go up throughout the year, as far as I've looked at it, and I'm concerned. Speaking to other economists, we seem to be in agreement on this one. So that's another big issue. And we could see wage growth as well being a concern there as well. So essentially, as I said earlier, it's locked in to go bust, right? So there's not really much the government can do. They can try and put as much as they want internationally, out of national insurance. They can raise that as much as they want. As I said earlier, with the Laffer curve, we're way past the peak, so now we're raising much less. We're actually crushing the economy to pull more tax out of it. As I said earlier, the forecasts are, way out. So we are essentially in an even larger deficit now. We know that, the cost of bonds and gilts has gone up because we're approaching a debt crisis as well. So the whole thing is broken, and we can't change national insurance too much because obviously we've got big productivity crisis as well in terms of bringing people into the economy. So there is nothing really the government can do to fix this without breaking the triple lock. And what I mean by that is getting rid of it. It just needs to go. And they just need to bring it back to 2.5% at most, right? So they need to get rid of CPI, they need to get rid of wage inflation, and they need to bring back that kind of, that benchmark. That's as far as it can go now, because if you add any more costs onto it, the economy is just not going to be able to cope, and we're going to have to drastically change it. As I said with immigration, the government have for so long now tried to prop up the British economy through immigration rather than going down the supply side deregulation, which we've been advocating for years. And I think we've been proved so right on this now that the Labour government are now trying to do supply side reform. That's a shocking thing to say, to your audience. The socialists are actually doing supply side reform now because the so-called right-wing party previously weren't doing that. And adding more and more regulations on. So the only solution here is change the policy, grow the economy, cut immigration, and fundamentally try and fix what is essentially this huge welfare state bill that is being levied on young people and productive businesses at the moment. There is no way out of this other than doing that. There's seriously not at all.
You keep suggesting that there's a much bigger and underlying issue in all of this with the welfare state and the amount of government spending and so on and so forth. What makes your report powerful is that it identifies the state pension issue as the thing where there has to be a reckoning either before this or because of this on this particular date. And that's what's new here, is someone is sort of putting their finger on a day in a particular cause, which is a brave thing to do, by the way. All of it, though, screams to me that means testing of a rather drastic and significant sort is what's coming. I feel like that's going to be quite a shock to people who've sort of built their retirement around the idea that they're going to have the state pension and then supplement that with their private system. We've now got this defined contribution system that's come in, replacing the defined benefit system that worked for some and not for others. It feels like there's going to be a rug pull at some point where the government's going to say, look, we promise you the state pension and your private pension of whatever format, defined contribution or defined benefit, but we're going to means test it. We can't afford both. So all of you people who have saved enough that you can afford to give up the state pension are going to have to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, basically. So we also know that 1 in 4 pensioners are millionaires, and that's defined by asset class. So what they're going to have to do is they're going to have to basically cut out those 1 in 4. So that's the first step. But actually, what we're going to need to happen is people are going to have to start selling their houses much earlier, and we're going to have to push the retirement age much further back. So we've been advocating for a long time is, if you own a house, that is an asset. That is a financial asset. You've taken out a financial product to buy it, your mortgage. So you need to use it like a financial product in the same way that, if I run out of money, if I'm very bad with my budgeting, I will have to sell my watch, or I will have to sell, my phone. I'll have to do some economizing. We need that to be the case for citizens in this country, because at the moment, you've already mentioned, the state pension. It's also the universal healthcare system, right? It's also social care, right? we are building up all of these kind of mattresses for people to fall onto, even though they're quite well protected anyway. Britain is quite a wealthy country. We do fit, we have all this doom and gloom about economic growth and whatever else. But actually, if you were working in the 80s and 90s, you were being prosperous. Your wage growth was high, productivity was high, people could save, the rate of saving was much higher. For people nowadays, for young people like myself, I would have to, if I wanted to live in London, which is increasingly not going to be the case as property prices increase, I would have to save like on like an average wage 27 times, right, without paying a penny in tax or any expenditure to pay for a house. Right, it's just not possible. Back in the 90s, I would have to do that. I'd have to do it 5 times over. Right, so I'd only have to, save 5 times my salary. Right, so the economies of scale are so different now, and now we have young people who can't afford to buy a house, who can't afford, quite nice luxuries in life that older people were able to enjoy. We're working really hard. There's a big mental health crisis because actually people are burned out. We had to experience the pandemic. We're being levied tax like no one's business. All in order to support wealthier people. So that's one of the big issues we're facing. And as I said earlier, social contract theory, very important. And this is why you're seeing a lot of right-wing young men turn to reform. We're seeing a serious problem with recruitment in the army. People don't want to go and serve their country because they feel like it's broken. And you can't walk around London without getting mugged. Right. So all of this expenditure, all of this hard work, whatever else to pay for this, this kind of social contract, it's just stopped working now. State pension is just one thing of a much larger, broader problem that needs very urgent redress. And if it's not fixed, Britain's gone. It's gone. I'm happy to be a massive doomer on this one. I think it is an existential threat to the future of the UK.
Not often outdone on the doom side. The idea of selling your house is the thing that could make the biggest dent in that, right? Unfortunately, those people you're telling that they might need to sell their house in order to fund their retirement is precisely the target market of this YouTube video. So I can just hear the unsubscribe bell on this YouTube video absolutely ringing away as you're going for it. But at least people will be aware of the threat that they could have the rug pulled on them when it comes to the state pension. So to sum up, it seems to me that the 2030s are going to be a decade of fiscal reckoning, especially for those reliant on government promises. And retirees are top of that list. Retirees with assets are also top of the list of potential welfare cuts. That makes the next decade extremely risky for those looking to ensure that they have enough to fund their retirement, the retirement that they thought they were promised by a politician. Maxwell, thanks for coming on, and to everyone at home, thanks for watching. What should investors make of all this? Well, the fiscal reckoning we all worry about really is going to occur within the next decade. Either the government goes bust trying to prop up the state pension, or it defaults on its promises to pensioners. Our investment director at Southbank Investment Research has been warning about the risks which the welfare system poses to the government's balance sheet for years. But he's recently put together a presentation that highlights how the coming fiscal crisis unfolds. He calls it the failure of our shadow currency. Thanks to the research from the Adam Smith Institute, we can now claim that this is going to begin to play out during your retirement, which means you need to prepare for it. That's what our shadow currency presentation is all about. You can check out the presentation on the failure of our shadow currency by clicking the link in the description or the comments section below. If you believe the government will get a grip on its welfare programs before going bust, then an outcome is actually pretty much the same for those of us trying to prepare for our retirement. We can't rely on the government to fund our future anymore. Thanks for watching.